What do you actually know about the woman behind that unmistakable chorus about toy soldiers marching off to war? Chances are, almost nothing beyond the song itself. It topped the American charts in the summer of 1989, sung by a former child star barely out of her teens, and it turned her overnight into one of the most recognizable voices in pop music. Then, at the very height of that fame, she disappeared. Not slowly, not gracefully. She simply stopped, walked away from a career most people would kill for, and left the public to invent their own explanations. Some blamed addiction, some blamed heartbreak. Few bothered to ask what actually happened behind the scenes, inside the studio, and inside the industry that built her from nothing. Her name was Martika, and the real story is stranger, and far more human, than the legend that replaced it. Long before the world knew the name Martika, there was a little girl named Marta Marrero, born in 1969 in Whittier, California, to Cuban parents who had fled their homeland during a revolution and rebuilt a life far from everything they had known. There was no old money in this story, no grandfather's fortune waiting to be inherited. What Marta had instead was a striking voice, an obvious camera presence, and parents willing to put her in front of casting directors while she was still a child. By the age of 13, she had already appeared on the big screen in the 1982 film version of Annie, one face among dozens of young hopefuls dancing and singing their way through Depression-era New York. It was enough to get her noticed. 2 years later, in 1984, she was cast on Kids Incorporated, the Disney Channel staple that functioned less like a children's show and more like a factory floor, quietly manufacturing the next generation of American pop stars. Marta played Gloria for 2 seasons, performing alongside a cast of kids who would go on to careers of their own, one of whom would later reinvent herself as Fergie of the Black Eyed Peas. On the surface, it looked like innocent fun, glittering sets and matching outfits and cover versions of the week's biggest radio hits. Underneath it, something else was quietly happening. A child was being trained, week after week, to perform an identity rather than simply live one, to understand, from a very young age, that being watched and being loved were, in this business, often treated as the same thing. Nobody around her called it grooming for stardom, but that is exactly what it was, and by the time Kids Incorporated ended in 1986, Marta Marrero had already spent more of her childhood being a product than being a girl. By 1988, the girl who had once been Gloria on Saturday morning television was gone, replaced by a name built specifically for a record label's marketing department, Martika. Columbia Records signed her that year, betting that a former child star with a strong voice and an easy camera presence could be repackaged as something entirely new, a solo pop artist standing on her own instead of inside an ensemble cast. Her self-titled debut album followed in October, and with it came the first single, a bright, mid-tempo number called More Than You Know, which climbed respectably into the American charts and did exactly what a first single is supposed to do. It introduced Martika to radio without asking too much of her, a gentle test balloon before the label committed to something bigger. Behind the scenes, the calculation was more complicated. Executives were watching closely to see whether a 19-year-old raised on children's television could plausibly be sold as an adult artist, someone audiences would take seriously rather than simply remember fondly from Saturday mornings. Every interview, every photo shoot, every carefully chosen outfit was part of that quiet negotiation between the girl she had been and the woman the label needed her to become. It was, in its own way, another version of the same bargain that had shaped her childhood. Perform the role convincingly enough, and the rewards would follow. There was serious money behind her now, a full promotional machine turning steadily in the background, and an unspoken expectation, never stated outright but understood by everyone in the room, that she would become whatever the charts eventually required of her. What nobody quite anticipated, not the label, not her producers, and certainly not Martika herself, was just how completely the album's second single would answer that question, and how much it would cost her to write it. On April 26, 1989, Columbia Records released the second single from Martika's debut album, a song called Toy Soldiers, and almost nobody involved in its creation expected it to become the moment that defined her entire career. It began, like so much of this story does, with a favor for a friend. Martika had watched someone close to her fall into a serious cocaine addiction, and she wanted to write about it. Though by her own later account, she was nervous even to try. Everything she had written before had been light, easy, radio-friendly material, and this was neither. Working with producer Michael J., she pushed through that hesitation and built a song around the idea of addiction as a kind of quiet warfare. Drugs commanding a person the way a child commands rows of toy soldiers, obedient and expendable. The recording opens on a single stark piano before the synths and her own voice swell into something far more vulnerable than anything on the album so far. The music video leaned into that same darkness, layering close-up shots of Martika against churning waterfalls, imagery clearly meant to evoke drowning, a person being pulled under by something they cannot control. It struck a nerve nobody at the label had fully planned for. Within weeks, Toy Soldiers climbed to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, holding the top spot for 2 full weeks that summer, and instantly outgrowing the modest, safe reputation the label had built around her first single. Listeners, for their part, largely got the meaning wrong. Many assumed it was simply a breakup song, another aching ballad about lost love, never realizing the chorus was actually about watching someone you care about disappear into addiction and, eventually, find their way back out. Martika had written the most serious song of her young career and turned it into the biggest hit of her life, and almost nobody outside her inner circle understood what it had actually cost her to finish it. The friend at the center of the song, by most accounts, did eventually get clean, though Martika chose never to reveal exactly who they were. For a 19-year-old who had spent most of her life performing other people's expectations, it was the first song that felt entirely, unmistakably her own. By the time the dust settled on that first album, Martika had sold more than 3 million copies worldwide, an extraordinary number for a debut, and one that changed the scale of everything happening around her. More singles followed the momentum of Toy Soldiers. A cover of Carole King's I Feel the Earth Move climbed into the top 30, and another track, Water, kept her name in steady rotation through most of 1990. She was no longer a promising new artist being tested by radio. She was, by every commercial measure the industry cared about, a certified success, and success in this business tends to arrive with its own demands attached. International markets wanted tours, television wanted appearances, magazine covers wanted a coherent story to sell, and the story they settled on was a strange, slightly uncomfortable one. The wholesome child of Saturday morning television, all grown up into a striking young woman capable of writing about addiction with real conviction. That contrast made good copy, but it also meant Martika was rarely allowed to simply exist as a musician. She was a symbol first, an artist second, expected to embody a tidy narrative arc for interviewers who had usually not listened past the singles. Behind the glossy touring schedule and the steady chart placements, something quieter was beginning to strain. Colleagues who worked with her during this period later described someone who was clearly exhausted, stretched thin across promotional obligations in multiple countries, rarely given the space to simply write without a release date already looming over the work. Columbia, naturally, wanted a second album, and wanted it soon, hoping to capitalize on a wave of momentum that showed no sign of slowing down. Nobody at the label seemed especially interested in whether the 20-year-old at the center of all that momentum actually had anything left to give it. There was, in fairness, plenty to be grateful for. A #1 single, a platinum album, a face recognized on several continents by 20. But gratitude and exhaustion, it turns out, are perfectly capable of occupying the same body at once. Friends who spoke about that period years later remembered someone still smiling for the cameras, while quietly counting down the days between engagements, never letting the strain show on stage or in front of a journalist. It was a skill Kids Incorporated had taught her early, and one the record industry now relied on completely. For her second album, Martika made a decision nobody at Columbia had specifically asked for, but one that would come to define the next chapter of her career. Rather than simply repeating the formula that had made her first record a hit, she went looking for Prince. It was a bold move for a young artist still finding her footing, approaching one of the most singular, uncompromising talents in popular music, and asking him to help reshape her sound entirely. To the surprise of many around her, he said yes. Prince wrote and produced several tracks for the resulting album, Martika's Kitchen, released in 1991, including a haunting, spiritually charged single called Love, Thy Will Be Done, co-written with Martika herself, and built around lyrics that leaned far closer to prayer than pop. It was, by any measure, a genuine artistic left turn, trading the bright, radio-ready instincts of her debut for something moodier, more introspective, and considerably harder to sell to the same audience that had fallen for Toy Soldiers 3 years earlier. For Martika personally, the collaboration represented real creative liberation, a chance to work alongside an artist who treated her as a serious collaborator rather than a product to be managed. For the label, it represented a considerable gamble. Prince's involvement guaranteed critical attention and a certain amount of curiosity, but it did not guarantee sales, and radio programmers accustomed to Martika's earlier hits were not entirely sure what to do with music this deliberately strange. When the album arrived, reviews were often genuinely admiring of its ambition, praising the reinvention as brave and unexpected. Commercially, though, it fell well short of her debut's numbers, never coming close to matching the multi-platinum success that had defined her first 3 years in the industry. The record label had wanted a bigger version of what already worked. What they got instead was a more honest, more difficult record, one that satisfied the artist far more than it satisfied the accountants. Somewhere in that gap, between what Martika needed creatively and what the business needed commercially, the pressure that had been quietly building since Kids Incorporated finally found somewhere to go. Those who worked alongside her during the sessions later described an artist genuinely energized by the music, staying late in the studio out of real enthusiasm rather than obligation. That energy, though, existed alongside a mounting awareness that the industry rarely rewards ambition on its own terms. Columbia's promotional machine, so effective at selling an accessible hit single, struggled to find a comparable strategy for an album this deliberately uncommercial. Interviews from the period show Martika defending the record with real conviction, insisting it represented exactly the artist she wanted to become. Even as the charts told a quieter story, it would prove to be the last full album Columbia released under her name. In 1992, Martika quit. Not slowed down, not took a break. Quit, entirely and abruptly, walking away from the music industry at precisely the moment most artists would have been fighting to stay inside it. There was no farewell single, no goodbye tour, no carefully staged final interview explaining her reasoning to the fans who had followed her since Toy Soldiers. 1 year she had been in the studio with Prince, building the most ambitious record of her career. The next, she was simply gone from the charts, gone from the magazines, gone from the promotional circuit that had defined nearly every year of her adult life so far. By her own account, given plainly and without much elaboration, the reason was burnout. She had been performing for cameras since she was a child, moved from one manufactured identity to another without much pause in between, and by 23, she had simply run out of whatever reserve of energy the industry had been drawing on since Kids Incorporated first put her in front of an audience. It is worth pausing here, because this is exactly the point where the public record and the public imagination part ways. In the absence of an official explanation loud enough to satisfy anyone, tabloids did what tabloids always do. They filled the silence with their own theories. There was talk of drugs. There was talk of a breakdown severe enough to require hospitalization. There was talk, inevitably, of some scandal too embarrassing for a label to acknowledge. None of it, as far as the documented record shows, holds up. What actually happened appears to have been simpler and, in its own way, sadder. A young woman who had never really been allowed to stop working finally decided to stop, on her own terms, before the industry decided for her. It is a far less sensational story than the rumors that replaced it, but it may also be the more honest one, and it says a great deal more about how this business treats its most successful young talents than any invented scandal ever could. Those closest to her at the time have described the decision less as a collapse and more as a kind of quiet self-rescue, a recognition that continuing on the same treadmill would eventually cost her something she could not get back. She did not disappear into rehab, and there is no credible record of the collapse the tabloids like to imply. What she did instead was simply stop answering the phone, stop showing up to the meetings, stop pretending that the next album cycle mattered more than her own exhaustion. For an industry built almost entirely on the assumption that its stars will keep giving until there is nothing left, A star who simply chooses to stop is its own kind of unsettling story, even without the drugs and breakdowns the rumor mill preferred. For more than a decade after that, Martika largely disappeared from public view. There was no dramatic comeback attempt, no tell-all interview explaining the years in between, just a long, quiet stretch in which the woman who had once topped the Billboard charts simply lived her life away from cameras. In 1998, a compilation album called I Feel the Earth Move surfaced, gathering her existing hits for a new generation of listeners, though it generated little of the fanfare that had once surrounded her every release. For anyone still paying attention, it was a modest reminder that she existed rather than a genuine return to the industry that had once consumed her entirely. Then, in 2004, something unexpected happened. Eminem, one of the biggest names in music at the time, sampled the unmistakable chorus of Toy Soldiers for a track on his album Encore, titling it Like Toy Soldiers and reintroducing that haunting melody to an audience who had likely never heard the original. The song became a massive hit in its own right, multi-platinum, inescapable on radio, and Martika, who had spent more than a decade largely forgotten by the mainstream industry, found herself receiving a songwriting credit on one of the biggest rap singles of the year. It was a strange kind of vindication, arriving from a completely unexpected direction. The song she had written as a 19-year-old about a friend's addiction, the one that had once defined and then quietly consumed her, was now reaching millions of new listeners through someone else's voice entirely. In 2005, riding that renewed attention, a further compilation, Toy Soldiers, The Best of Martika, was released. She had not asked for the spotlight to return. It had simply found her again, on terms she had not chosen, much like the fame that started it all. There was something almost poetic about it. A song built to warn people about losing control of themselves had become the very thing she could no longer control, resurrected by someone else's creative decision, credited to her name, but driven entirely by another artist's vision. She gave a handful of measured interviews around the resurgence, grateful for the renewed interest without chasing it further. For a woman who had once walked away from an entire industry rather than keep performing on someone else's schedule, the irony was not lost on her. In the years since, Martika has never fully returned to the version of fame she once had, and by every indication, she has never wanted to. She has surfaced occasionally, on her own schedule rather than a label's, contributing here and there to projects that interested her without ever chasing the kind of relentless promotional cycle that once defined her early 20s. There is something quietly instructive in that choice. A woman who learned, the hard way, that visibility and well-being are not the same thing, and who has spent the decades since guarding the second at some cost to the first. The deeper irony of her story is easy to miss if you only know the song. Toy Soldiers was written to warn listeners about losing themselves to something they could not control, a friend's addiction rendered as a haunting metaphor about children commanded like toys. But the person the song ultimately reveals most clearly is Martika herself, a child performer handed over to an industry at an age when she could not possibly consent to what that industry would ask of her, who spent the next decade discovering exactly how much of herself that industry expected her to give up. Framed that way, the real dark story here was never about pills or a scandal invented by tabloids desperate to explain her silence. It was about a business built on consuming young talent as efficiently as possible, and about one artist who managed to walk away from that machine with more of herself intact than most ever do. Her voice still plays on the radio most summers, still gets sampled, still reaches listeners who have no idea who she is or what it cost her to write it. That, in the end, might be the most fitting legacy possible for Martika, a woman largely forgotten by the industry that built her, immortalized anyway by 4 minutes of a song she almost didn't have the nerve to finish. There is a certain justice in that, even if nobody planned it. The industry that once treated her as a product to be marketed and eventually discarded never got the ending it wanted, a graceful comeback or a tragic downfall to sell as a cautionary tale. What it got instead was quieter and far harder to package. A woman who simply chose herself, once, when it mattered most, and lived to tell the story on her own terms. I've been Chester. See you next time. Cheers.